Okay, welcome to Spooky Isles. My name's David. Today we're going to be talking to author and paranormal researcher John Fraser. How are you, John?
I'm not too bad, not too bad. Pleasure to be on Spooky Isles. I'm looking forward to talking to you about poltergeists mainly, I think.
Yes, I think that's what we're going to do. Your new book is coming out in a couple of months' time, I believe, called Poltergeist, an imaginative title, and I'm sure you put a lot of thought into that. Uh,
It does have a subtitle as well.
well, what's the subtitle? Tell us the subtitle then.
It's Poltergeist, a new investigation into destructive hauntings. In some ways, it builds on Colin Wilson's book from 37 years ago, Poltergeist, a study into destructive hauntings. There probably hasn't been a similar book about poltergeists in general for 37 years. There's been a lot of books about a poltergeist or a particular haunting, but very few, if any, about poltergeists. So I thought it was probably time to put that right.
Okay, well, tell us a little bit about yourself, John. You've been involved in this quite a long time, the paranormal field. You were actually quite young when you joined the Ghost Club, weren't you?
I It's rumoured that I'm the only active member that had to join by invitation only. Up until 1993, you had to actually be invited by the council to join the Ghost Club, and I actually managed to do so through a very strange route where I investigated a haunted house in a place called Sandwood Bay, 3 miles from the nearest road, surrounded by peat bogs. So I ended up spending the night there, doing a bit of research, getting in contact with the then chairman of the Ghost Club, Peter Underwood, and managed to join it that way. These days, it's far, far easier. You just fill in an application form and show that you're a sane and sensible person.
I don't know. Is that prerequisite? Is it to
I
be
think
sane and
so.
sensible?
If you start talking about devil worship or anything like that, perhaps they might reject you.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, I'm a member, so clearly lots of people can become members of that. So, I mean, that Sandwood Bay, that sounds almost very Women in Black type. What? Tell us about that a little bit. That sounds like it might have been an interesting investigation, especially for a young
Um,
bloke.
it was what you call one of these wild ad hoc investigations. When you read a lot of ghost literature, when you're a little bit younger, you kind of think the ultimate would be spending the night in a haunted house all by yourself. Sandwood Bay is right in the north tip of Scotland with a ruined cottage. Um, uh, and as I say, it's about 3 or 4 miles from the nearest road, so you have to walk there. And as it's surrounded by peat bogs, there's no walking back afterwards. You are trapped in a haunted house. Now, the actual investigation, I probably didn't discover much. But afterwards, I did quite a lot of research into the haunting, and I discovered in the next bothy there was actually a fascinating character called James McVeary Smith. Now, Sandwood Bay is supposed to be haunted by the ghost of a sailor with a big bushy beard and a peaked cap. And there was this character called James McVeary Smith who had a big bushy beard and a peaked cap. So was a spitting image and might well have explained at least some of the more recent sightings at the time. The bad news is, for people who want to go on intrepid wild ghost hunts, is since I've been there, somebody has stolen the roof of the Sandwood Bay cottage, and it's impossible to spend the night there anymore. So I will be the last and only person to have done that.
There you go, and it's led you on a quite a interesting career to the point you are now. Can you tell us a little bit about some of the stuff you've done? You're on the, and I can never remember the name of this, but spontaneous. Tell me what it is. I can't remember the name of this.
I'm currently on the council of the Society for Psychical Research, which, for those that don't know, is an old body that was founded in 1882, quite well funded. Obviously, into psychical research, and I'm also on the Spontaneous Cases Committee, which is a bit of a mouthful, but not as much as one of the other organisations, the Association for the Scientific Study of Anomalous Phenomena. Now that takes some saying.
It does. They like their acronyms and big long words, does the ghost world. So what in the time that you did your first investigation to now, what have you learned that you could actually add to Colin Wilson's work?
I think there's probably been quite a lot happening with regards to our possible understanding of poltergeists. I mean, Colin Wilson had a funny experience while writing the book. And Colin Wilson is basically somebody that is very interested in how the mind works. He calls himself a sort of existentialist philosopher. And he started off thinking that poltergeists were something in the mind, and then suddenly flipped over halfway through the book and started believing in discarnate spirits. Now, since then, we've had quite a lot happening in the poltergeist fields. For example, we've had a gentleman called Barry Colvin, who has actually been investigating poltergeist raps and has come to the conclusion they have a very, very different acoustic sound to the normal sort of rap. If I rapped my knuckle on the table like that, in effect, can you? In effect, you would the sound peaks a lot slower than when you'd obviously knock on the table. When the sound peaks immediately, it's as if the sound is coming out of the wood rather than being put into the wood. Yeah. You've also had a very interesting bit of research by a lady called Mary Rose Barrington, who unfortunately has passed on just about a couple of months ago, connecting strange one-off incidents called jots as possibly being low-level poltergeist activity. And jots is yet another anachronism for just one of those things.
Yes.
In effect, when something disappears and then reappears in the same place, or reappears somewhere extremely silly where you possibly couldn't have put it. Now, these happen to everybody, but these are also a trend at the beginning of a poltergeist case. So there's two things, just as an example, that Mr. Wilson wouldn't have been aware of at the time.
So this is not your first book. You originally wrote Ghosthunting: A Survivor's Guide, which I have a copy there. See, it's my copy. I've not obviously got a copy of your new book yet because it's not out yet. What are people going to find different from this, the first book to the next one? Because that's obviously about ghost hunting. What's in Poltergeist that's a little bit different?
The first book is a straight guide to ghost hunting. It can't be that bad because it says it's a survivor's guide, and 10 years later I'm still around. But I think there's two things about this new book. I would hope it kind of takes you on a journey. You don't have to be so into the subject that you can't just read it as a book. It has a lot of facts, but it's written in a way that kind of takes you on a journey to where I made my conclusions. And it's obviously a lot more focused on trying to work out what a particular type of phenomena is, and rather than just how to investigate it. It also comes with the premise that everyone that goes hunting ghosts, if you like, fleeting glimpses of things in the night and what have you, is probably not going to come to any firm scientific conclusions as to whether or not they exist. There's too many psychological reasons that would equally explain them. But with poltergeists, if, say, for example, a cup flies across the room, you're into what I would call a fact or fraud scenario. Either somebody made it up, somebody tricked somebody else, or you've got something beyond the bounds of science, which is why I find them so interesting. You have something that is testable and provable, and something the psychologists can't kind of explain. So that's kind of the premise that made me write the book, because it's been very neglected and because it is a potential way of proving or even disproving the paranormal. But it's about time we started to come to some conclusions, because let's face it, we've been going around in circles for probably 150 years.
There is actually quite a lot of evidence, isn't there? I mean, even if it's just people seeing things or hearing things, there's a lot out there, isn't there? What kind of evidence did you use as part of your book?
Well, I've taken quite a few famous cases, and quite a few not quite so famous cases. One really interesting case, I think, is the talking mongoose of Cashin's Gap. Now,
Is
Harry, this is Geff or Jeff or whatever you want to call him. Now, Harry Price got himself a lot of ridicule for investigating it, because it was being portrayed as a talking mongoose. And, you don't investigate talking mongooses, do you?
John, can you move to the center of the screen a little bit? Just move to the center.
Of course I can, yes.
Sorry.
But
go ahead.
But the interesting thing about that is, take away what the teenage girl thought it was, and you've got a lot of typical poltergeist activity, knocks and bangs, the odd discarnate voice, things moving around. It's very much in tune with, say, the Bell Witch case of America in the 1830s in Tennessee, which was identified as a witch but had lots of noises, knocks and bangs and so on. One of the key interesting things of poltergeists is if you go around the world, they tend to be identified as different things. There's an awful lot of cases in Romania in which they call vampire cases, which would be equally ridiculed for investigating, that when you look beneath the surface turn out to be very much like your normal poltergeist. So that kind of shows it's also a very common worldwide event.
Yeah. So what do you think they are then? What is it? This is like a big question that you could write a whole book about. But
well, yeah, I did, didn't I? Well, that's nearly a spoiler, because we don't get to that bit until the final chapter. But but I mean, Colin Wilson, as I say, started off thinking they came from within the mind, and then kind of flipped over. It's quite possible during the book you'll find that I possibly start gradually flipping back and actually thinking that they are probably a power within us, if indeed they do exist. There's always that provisor.
Okay, well, that's interesting. So you're saying it's not necessarily the house, say, it would be the person in the house that you think is what's causing the phenomena.
It's undoubtedly a combination of factors. Undoubtedly, I mean, there's a very interesting case called Langenhue Church, which Peter Underwood investigated. It's sadly been demolished now, which had a major earthquake in Colchester, believe it or not, in the late 19th century.
Yeah, we have an article on SPRs. We'll link to it into the notes. Yeah.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and a lot of phenomena seems to take place in areas of seismic activity, of which Langenhue, especially in Britain, is a perfect example. So it's more like possibly something within us, but possibly add a few environmental factors in as well, and possibly add a fear factor. If you're particularly stressed up with something, it seems to possibly trigger phenomena off. And if you're particularly stressed up by thinking you're in a haunted house, that probably does no harm either.
Yeah. So I mean, I've heard people put poltergeists in a whole new category that can't really go in with ghosts or spirits or anything like that, what we would class as sort of, your traditional phantoms. Would you be of that mind that poltergeists are a completely different kettle of fish?
No, I think there's far too much compartmentalization in the sort of paranormal. I mean, for example, you've got ghosts, poltergeists, mediums. If you look at for example, the Schneider brothers in Germany, famous mediums in the 1930s, a lot of what they may have done was very close to spontaneous psychokinesis, which is, or not spontaneous in their case. They were obviously potentially trained to do it. A lot of poltergeist activity could be the spontaneous version of that. I think if the paranormal exists, it's one particular power that exerts itself in particular ways. To say that there's X, Y, and Z is probably not correct. And I kind of came to that conclusion a bit during writing this book as well. So the more I looked into it, the more I wouldn't say certain, because nobody can be certain about these things, but the more fairly certain I got.
Okay. You've investigated poltergeist activity, I imagine, yourself over the years, and has there been anything that stood out to you that you think would be interesting for you to talk about now? That's something, because people, you see lots of stuff on the television, and it's always very exciting, where you've got things flying around rooms and all sorts of kind of palaver. What would you say is the sort of like the typical poltergeist haunting, as it were, if there can be such a thing?
Well, the typical poltergeist haunting seems to normally start when there's been some kind of stress in the family, possibly a death, possibly moving house. Going back to Geff the mongoose, you had the circumstances where a teenage girl was living in a house miles away from any other houses, and probably lonely and distracted and reaching puberty. So there's always that trigger. Then you sometimes get object movements such as jots. Then you sometimes get movements that are actually seen. Then you get all kinds of potential things happening, possibly raps and bangs. Possibly some ghostly phenomena as well. I think there was a survey done that said there's about a 30% overlap between ghost and poltergeist phenomena, and then every case tends to take a life of its own, but within those kind of confines.
Yeah, you obviously you knew the investigators for Enfield, and this is obviously the really big one here in Britain to talk about Enfield. What are your personal feelings about that case?
Enfield's fascinating because I have a theory, which I describe in a roundabout way, that a poltergeist would be the worst drinking companion in a pub you could possibly imagine, especially when we do get back to pubs, in that they don't tend to say anything or communicate anything intelligently. Nearly all the cases are just random raps and bangs, maybe saying, I think in the Andover case, the poltergeist tried to predict football results, not very successfully. But that's about the level you get. Enfield, however, you got a lot of intelligent communication, which kind of makes it stick out. Now, did they do everything right when investigating Enfield? Possibly not, but you have hundreds of hours of tapes, which the SPR are currently actually trying to compile into some kind of order, and you have one very experienced investigator in Guy Playfair, and another very clever investigator, the ex-inventor Morris Gross. And between the two of them, I think they probably got most things right. The question is trying to track back 30 to 40 years and, trying to piece the things together. But what Enfield does have is probably dozens, if not hundreds, of independent witnesses. So it's very difficult to say that nothing happened.
Yeah, and that's an interesting thing, isn't it? I think I read the review that one of our writers did of your book on Spooky Owls, and they're talking about the idea that if you've got so many witnesses to something, how do you discount so many witnesses? If it was in a murder trial or any kind of criminal criminal trial, you'd convict on some of this stuff, wouldn't you?
Yeah, this is actually to give it more credence, this is actually a theory based on a paper written by a barrister who just also happens to be a paranormal investigator, my colleague and chair of the Ghost Club, Alan Murdy, and he puts a very sensible argument in that which is based on what they call similar fact evidence. If enough people say independently that they've seen something, it gives it enough credence in the court of law to convict somebody. And if it gives enough credence in the court of law to convict somebody, why not then enough proof to at least say there is a decent possibility that there may be ghosts or poltergeists? That's actually even more applicable for ghosts, because every ghost has a possible psychological explanation. But if 20 people independently see the same thing without knowing the other people have seen it, then it starts to get far, far more interesting and can provide evidence.
Well, thank you for that, John. We'll finish up here, but first, before we go, how do people get a copy of your book?
Well, at the moment, it's being formally published in Amazon at the end of July. However, I do have a few review copies, which I was going to sell in talks and what have you, but the talks seem to have suddenly dried up due to the unfortunate virus we have going around. So I believe Spooky Isles has already been kind enough to provide my email should anyone be interested in having buying a review copy or getting further information on it. So if anyone does want a copy, to buy a copy in advance, please feel free to email me.
No worries. We'll make sure there's a link down in the bottom there that people can get in contact with you if they're like, well, thank you, John, for that. Take care. It is, as you say, there's a virus going around that's causing a bit of havoc, so we've all got to look after ourselves. So you take care, and we'll talk to you later. Okay?
Okay, thank you very much.
See you. Bye-bye.